They could smell him 3 rooms away. Courtiers gagged. An ambassador fled to vomit. This wasn't some peasant rotting in the streets. This was Henry VIII, King of England, and what was festering inside his legs was so horrifying that even his own physicians recoiled in horror. Pus, bone fragments, flesh dying from the inside out. If you think you know Tudor history, you don't know this. Before we go deeper into the nightmare that was Henry's rotting legs, do yourself a favor, subscribe. Because what comes next will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Tudor king. The year was 1527. Henry VIII was 36 years old, and by all accounts, still magnificent. Broad-shouldered, athletic, towering over his courtiers at 6 feet 2 inches. He jousted, he hunted, he danced until dawn. This was not yet the bloated tyrant of legend. This was a king at the height of his power, a man who believed his body was as invincible as his throne. But something was wrong. That spring, while staying in Canterbury, Henry was suddenly confined to his bed. A varicose ulcer had opened on his left thigh. The pain was sharp, relentless. For a man who prided himself on physical prowess, this was more than an inconvenience. It was humiliating. His chief surgeon, Thomas Vicary, was summoned immediately. Vicary was one of the finest medical minds in England, a man who would later write groundbreaking texts on anatomy. He examined the wound carefully. The ulcer was angry, inflamed, weeping fluid, but Vicary had seen worse. He applied his treatments, poultices, bandages, careful cleaning. Within weeks, the wound closed. Henry rose from his bed, triumphant. The ulcer was gone. He returned to the tilt-yard, to the hunt, to the life he loved. Vicary had saved him, or so they thought. What neither Henry nor Vicary could have known was that beneath the surface of that healed skin, something far more sinister was taking root. The original injury had damaged the deep tissue of his leg. The veins were compromised, circulation was failing, and while the wound appeared closed on the outside, inside, the foundation was crumbling. Medical historians now believe that this first ulcer was caused by chronic venous insufficiency, a condition where blood pools in the lower legs, weakening the tissue and making it prone to breaking down. Some accounts suggest Henry's fashionable garters, worn tight around his calves to show off his muscular legs, may have restricted blood flow. Others point to earlier jousting injuries that had gone unnoticed, minor traumas that accumulated over years of brutal physical competition. But in 1527, no one understood venous disease. No one knew that once these ulcers form, they rarely heal permanently. And no one could have predicted what would happen 9 years later. For now, Henry believed he was cured. He walked without pain. He rode his horses. He convinced himself that the ulcer had been nothing more than a temporary setback, an inconvenience quickly overcome. But the clock was ticking, and when the reckoning came, it would be catastrophic. January 24th, 1536. Greenwich Palace. The tilt-yard was packed with courtiers, all eager to watch their king demonstrate his legendary skill. At 44 years old, Henry still insisted on jousting, despite his physician's quiet concerns. He was fully armored, nearly 300 pounds of man and metal combined, mounted on a massive warhorse bred for war. The lance was lowered, the signal given. Horse and rider thundered down the list. Then everything went wrong. Eyewitnesses would later struggle to describe exactly what happened. Some said the horse stumbled. Others claimed Henry misjudged the approach. What is certain is this: the king fell, and his 1,200-pound armored warhorse, unable to stop its momentum, came crashing down directly on top of him. The impact was catastrophic. Henry lay motionless in the dirt, pinned beneath the weight of his own mount. Courtiers rushed forward, shouting for help. It took several men to pull the animal off the king's body. When they finally freed him, Henry wasn't moving. His eyes were closed. He wasn't speaking. For 2 hours, the King of England lay unconscious. The court held its breath. Messengers were dispatched. Physicians scrambled. Anne Boleyn, pregnant with what Henry desperately hoped would be a son, was kept away from the chaos. Rumors spread like wildfire through the palace. Some whispered that the king was dead. Others feared brain damage, paralysis, the end of the Tudor line. When Henry finally opened his eyes, gasping for air, the relief was palpable. He was alive. He was conscious. He could speak, could move his limbs. The concussion was severe, but he would survive. But there was something else. The fall had done more than knock him unconscious. The crushing weight of the horse, the brutal impact against the frozen ground. It had torn open the old wound on his left thigh. The ulcer that Thomas Vickery had so carefully healed 9 years earlier was back. And this time, it had brought company. Within days, it became clear that both of Henry's legs were now affected. The right leg, which had taken much of the impact from the fall, developed an ulcer of its own. The king's physicians examined the wounds with growing alarm. These weren't simple cuts or bruises. They were deep, angry, refusing to close. Henry was confined to bed once again. But this time, the rest would not bring healing. This time, the wounds would never fully close. And as the weeks turned to months, and the months turned to years, those ulcers would transform from painful inconveniences into something far darker. The accident had set something irreversible into motion. The king's body had begun its long, agonizing descent into decay. The wounds didn't behave like normal injuries. They should have scabbed over, formed scar tissue, closed within weeks. Instead, they did the opposite. They opened wider, they deepened, and they began to weep. Not blood, something far worse. A thick, yellowish fluid seeped constantly from both legs. Pus. The medical term is purulent drainage, and it meant one thing: infection. But this wasn't a surface infection that could be washed away or treated with herbs. This was something happening deep inside the tissue, in places no Tudor physician could see or reach. Modern medical analysis of Henry's symptoms points to a condition called osteomyelitis, a bacterial infection of the bone itself. When bone becomes infected, it doesn't heal the way flesh does. The infection burrows deep into the marrow, killing the bone from the inside. As the bone dies, fragments begin to break away. These pieces, called sequestra, have nowhere to go. So they migrate. Slowly, agonizingly, they work their way toward the surface, pushing through muscle, fat, and skin. Imagine splinters of your own skeleton trying to escape your body. But the bone fragments were only part of the nightmare. Beneath Henry's skin, pockets of infection were forming abscesses filled with pus and dead tissue. These abscesses would swell, pressing against healthy flesh until the pressure became unbearable. Then they would rupture, either internally or breaking through the skin's surface in sudden, agonizing releases. And then there were the fistulae. These were tunnel-like tracts that formed between the abscesses and the skin, creating permanent channels through which infection could drain. In some perverse way, the fistulae were keeping Henry alive. As long as the infection had a way out, it couldn't spread through his bloodstream and kill him outright. But when those channels closed, even temporarily, the trapped infection would trigger fever, delirium, and what we now recognize as sepsis. Henry's own letters reveal the terror of these episodes. He described humors falling into his legs with no outlet, leaving him unable to speak, his face turning black, gasping for air as his body tried to fight an enemy it couldn't name. His physicians had no understanding of bacteria, no concept of bone infection. They saw the pus and believed the body was expelling bad humors, an imbalance that needed to be drained. They saw the wounds close and thought it was healing. They had no idea that beneath the surface, Henry's bones were rotting, that fragments were breaking loose, that his own skeleton was becoming foreign matter, his body desperately needed to expel. The king was being devoured from within, and there was nothing anyone in the 16th century could do to stop it. Henry VIII was not a man given to admitting weakness. He was the supreme head of the Church of England, the most powerful monarch in Europe, a king who had defied the Pope himself. To show vulnerability was to invite challenge, to appear mortal in a world that demanded he be something more. But pain has a way of stripping away even the most carefully constructed facades. In a private letter to the Duke of Norfolk, Henry did something extraordinary. He told the truth. "To be frank with you," he wrote, his words carefully chosen, "a humor has fallen into our legs." It was the closest the king would ever come to saying, "I am suffering. I am afraid." The letter continued with details his physicians had insisted upon. He was not to travel during the heat of the day. The exertion, the warmth it made the swelling worse, made the drainage heavier. His body could no longer tolerate what it once endured without thought. But it was another account, documented by those close to the king, that revealed just how close Henry came to death during these episodes. For 10 to 12 days, the humors the infection had no outlet. The fistulae had closed over, trapping everything inside. Henry's body began to shut down. He stopped speaking. His face turned black from lack of oxygen as sepsis flooded his system. Courtiers watched in horror, certain they were witnessing the king's final hours. He was, by all accounts, in great danger. Yet somehow his body fought back. Whether through sheer will or the eventual rupture of the closed fistulae, the infection found release. The fever broke. Henry regained consciousness. He survived, but each episode left him weaker. Each brush with death took something from him that could never be recovered. The psychological toll was perhaps even more devastating than the physical. Henry had always been a man of action hunting until exhaustion, dancing until his courtiers collapsed, jousting even when his physicians begged him to stop. Now his own body was betraying him. The legs that had once carried him through tournaments were failing. The strength he had taken for granted was slipping away, and he knew it. There's a particular cruelty in watching your own decline, in feeling your body become a prison. Henry's letters from this period carry an edge they didn't before, sharper, more paranoid, less forgiving. The man who had once been generous with second chances became infamous for his sudden rages and brutal punishments. Was it the pain? The infection spreading toxins through his bloodstream? Or simply the unbearable reality that the King of England was rotting alive, one leg at a time, and there was nothing his wealth or power could do to stop it? The answer, perhaps, was all three. The king's physicians gathered in the royal chamber, their faces grave. Before them lay Henry VIII, his legs exposed, the ulcers weeping their familiar yellow discharge. The air was thick with the smell of infection, but the doctors had long since grown accustomed to it. They had a theory about what needed to be done. The wounds must not be allowed to close. This was the prevailing medical wisdom of the Tudor age. The body, they believed, was filled with humors, invisible fluids that governed health and disease. When these humors became corrupted, they had to escape. The ulcers were not injuries to be healed, but necessary openings through which poison could drain. To let them close would be to trap the corruption inside. And so they brought out the tools of their trade. An iron poker, heated in the fireplace until it glowed red. No anesthetic existed beyond strong wine, and even that was considered a luxury that might dull the senses when clarity was needed. The physicians believed the patient should remain alert, able to report what they felt, where the pain centered. Henry would have watched as the glowing metal approached his flesh. The procedure was called cauterization. The hot poker would be pressed directly into the ulcer, burning away what the doctors considered diseased tissue. The theory was that heat would purify, would prevent the humors from becoming further corrupted. The reality was something far different. Each application of the red-hot iron destroyed healthy tissue along with the infected. It created new wounds on top of old ones. And in an age before anyone understood bacteria, it introduced new contamination with every treatment. The very tools meant to heal were spreading infection deeper into Henry's legs. One contemporary observer noted dryly that this therapy was unlikely to have improved the king's temper. It's a masterpiece of understatement. Imagine enduring this not once, but regularly, week after week, month after month for years. The anticipation alone would be its own special torture, knowing the pain was coming, unable to refuse it because these were the finest physicians in England, and this was medicine. Henry had no choice but to submit. To refuse treatment would be to admit the doctors were wrong, to acknowledge that perhaps nothing could help him. And that admission was more terrifying than the poker itself. So he endured. He gritted his teeth as the metal seared his flesh. He smelled his own skin burning. He felt the shock of heat penetrating deep into tissue that was already screaming with infection. And when it was over, when the poker was withdrawn and the wound dressed with fresh bandages, he knew with absolute certainty that in a few weeks they would do it all over again. The cauterization was only the beginning. Once the burning was done, once the poker had done its work, the real experimentation began. Because Tudor physicians didn't simply wound and walk away. They had an entire arsenal of substances they believed could draw out corruption and restore balance. Henry's physicians prepared their mixtures with the solemnity of alchemists. And in many ways, that's exactly what they were. First came the poultices. Chamomile was a favorite, crushed and mixed with other herbs into a thick paste that would be packed directly into the open wounds. The theory was sound enough. Chamomile had natural anti-inflammatory properties. But pressed into infected tissue already compromised by hot iron, it did little more than provide a breeding ground for more bacteria. But chamomile was the gentle option. Henry himself took an active interest in his treatments. He wasn't content to simply receive whatever his physicians prescribed. He studied medical texts, consulted with apothecaries, and created his own remedies. The royal still room became a laboratory where the king ground pearls into fine powder, believing their purity could somehow transfer to corrupted flesh. He mixed white lead into gray plaster, creating thick compounds that would be smeared across his legs. White lead, what we now know as a toxic substance that causes organ damage and neurological problems, was considered medicinal pure healing. Then there was the fox oil. Oleum vulpinum, rendered from the fat of foxes, was a prized treatment for gout and arthritis. Henry's physicians believed it could penetrate deep into joints and dissolve the crystallized humors causing pain. So they rubbed it into his legs, around the ulcers, sometimes directly into the wounds themselves. The smell must have been extraordinary rancid animal fat mixed with infection, all sealed beneath linen bandages that wouldn't be changed for days. But perhaps nothing illustrated the desperation of Tudor medicine quite like the enemas. When external treatments failed to produce results, physicians turned inward. They prepared solutions of dill oil mixed with white wine and added chicken grease for viscosity. Duck grease was considered superior for certain conditions. Butter and egg whites were blended in to create the proper consistency. This mixture would be loaded into an animal bladder, fitted with a tube, and inserted. The logic was simple. If the humors wouldn't drain from the legs, perhaps they could be expelled from the bowels instead. None of it worked. None of it could work, because the enemy wasn't humors, or corrupted fluids, or imbalanced elements. It was bacteria multiplying in dead bone, creating colonies deep inside tissue where no poultice or oil or enema could possibly reach. But the physicians didn't know that, so they kept trying. And Henry, desperate for relief, kept letting them. There was a terrible irony at the heart of Henry's treatment. The very thing that was slowly killing him was also keeping him alive. The fistulae those tunnel-like tracks burrowing through his legs were, in the eyes of Tudor medicine, proof that treatment was working. The doctors saw the constant drainage and nodded with satisfaction. Good. The corruption is escaping. The body is purging itself. They had no idea they were looking at a disaster in slow motion. Medical texts of the period were explicit in their instructions. A work published in 1562, just 15 years after Henry's death, urged physicians to keep such channels open at all costs. Patients were ordered to remain in bed during treatment, to avoid any activity that might cause the drainage passages to close prematurely. But Henry was a king, and kings do not stay in bed. He had a kingdom to rule, court politics to navigate, marriages to arrange and dissolve. So he walked. He sat through endless council meetings. He moved through his palaces, and with each step, the fragile tissue around those fistulae tore and reformed, never quite healing, never quite closing. And when they did close, even for a few days, the consequences were terrifying. The infection, suddenly trapped with nowhere to go, would turn inward. Within hours, Henry would develop a raging fever. His skin would flush, then pale. The pressure inside his legs became excruciating as abscesses swelled with nowhere to drain. His physicians would watch helplessly as the king's condition deteriorated, his breathing shallow, his mind drifting in and out of delirium. Then came the emergency intervention. Out came the instruments, the probes designed to find and reopen the closed fistulae. Sometimes the pressure would rupture the blockage on its own, the skin splitting as pus erupted outward. Other times, the physicians had to manually pierce through the newly formed tissue, essentially creating fresh wounds to restore the drainage, and the cycle would begin again. It was a medical catch-22 that no one in the 16th century could fully grasp. Keep the wounds open. An infection had a highway into Henry's body. Let them close, and the trapped infection would trigger sepsis. There was no winning strategy, no path to actual healing. The king's body had become a battlefield where every treatment was simultaneously cure and poison. His physicians documented each episode meticulously, noting when the fistulae closed, how long before fever set in, what methods successfully reopened them. They were building a record of failure, though they didn't recognize it as such. To them, each survival was a victory, proof that their methods worked. They never understood that they weren't saving Henry's life. They were simply prolonging his dying. And with every intervention, every reopening, every application of their remedies, they were ensuring that the infection would never, could never, be defeated. If Henry VIII had fallen from his horse in 1936 instead of 1536, he might have lived to old age. The difference of 400 years and the discovery of penicillin would have changed everything. Modern medical analysis of Henry's documented symptoms paints a clear picture of what was actually happening inside those ulcers. The diagnosis is osteomyelitis chronic bone infection, and it's a condition that even today is notoriously difficult to treat. In the 16th century, without antibiotics or surgical techniques to remove infected bone, it was essentially a death sentence delivered in installments. Here's what the doctors couldn't see. When bone becomes infected, it begins to die. But unlike soft tissue, dead bone doesn't simply dissolve or get absorbed by the body. Instead, fragments separate from the healthy bone around them. These pieces, trapped inside the body, become what modern surgeons call sequestrophore objects that the immune system desperately tries to expel. The body creates abscesses around these bone fragments, trying to wall them off. It forms fistulae to push them toward the surface. Everything Henry's physicians observed, the drainage, the recurring infections, the channels that refused to close, wasn't the disease itself. It was his body's frantic, failing attempt to solve a problem it couldn't reach. Modern surgical protocol for chronic osteomyelitis is straightforward but brutal. Surgeons perform what is called a tug test. They probe the infected area and physically pull at any loose bone. If it moves, it's dead. and dead bone must be removed, no exceptions. The procedure is called debridement, and it involves cutting away all infected and necrotic tissue until only healthy bone and flesh remain. Without this intervention, the infection simply persists. Forever, the bacteria colonize the dead bone, creating what's essentially a permanent reservoir of infection. Antibiotics can suppress the symptoms, reduce the bacterial load, but they can't eliminate bacteria hiding inside dead tissue where blood flow and thus medication can't reach. Henry's physicians had no concept of any of this. They couldn't see bone. They didn't understand bacterial colonization. They had no tools to remove necrotic tissue beyond the surface level. Their hot pokers and probes could burn and pierce flesh, but they couldn't reach the infected bone festering beneath. Even if they had somehow managed to identify the problem, they lacked the means to solve it. Amputation might have saved him, but removing a king's leg was politically unthinkable. And even that drastic measure would have required surgical techniques and infection control that would exist for centuries. So the infection remained. The bone continued gnawing. The fragments kept working their way through tissue, creating new abscesses, new fistulae, new cycles of fever and crisis. Henry VIII wasn't just sick. He was trapped in a medical nightmare with no possible escape, treated by the finest physicians in Europe who were, through no fault of their own, utterly powerless to help him. There are some details history tries to forget. The grand portraits, the elaborate tapestries, the formal records of state, they all conspire to present a sanitized version of the past. But sometimes the truth breaks through in the accounts of those who are actually there, and they all mention the smell. By 1546, courtiers had developed an unofficial early warning system. When the king was approaching, you knew it before you saw him. The odor announced his presence 3 rooms away. Not the pleasant sense of rose water or lavender that other nobles used to mask their natural odors. This was something else entirely, something that no amount of perfume could disguise. This wasn't courtly gossip or enemy propaganda. This detail appears in multiple independent accounts from people who had every reason to be loyal to Henry. Ambassadors, attendants, members of the Privy Council all documented the same phenomenon. One foreign ambassador, a man trained in diplomatic discretion, found himself in an impossible situation during an audience with the king. As Henry spoke, the diplomat's face grew pale. He struggled to maintain his composure, to keep his expression neutral. But the smell was overwhelming, a physical presence in the room that couldn't be ignored. Finally, he made his excuses. Some urgent matter that required his immediate attention. He fled the royal presence and barely made it to a private corridor before vomiting. The incident was quietly recorded. No official complaint could be made, of course. You didn't tell the King of England that his rotting legs had made you physically ill. But the ambassador's staff knew. The English courtiers knew. Everyone knew. And Henry knew too. There's no evidence he ever addressed it directly. How could he? To acknowledge the smell would be to acknowledge his decay, his mortality, the failure of his body to be as magnificent as his position demanded. So it simply became one more unspoken horror of court life, one more thing everyone noticed and no one mentioned. The ladies attending him developed techniques for breathing shallowly through their mouths. Servants burned extra incense in his chambers. Windows were opened more frequently, even in winter. But nothing truly helped, because the smell wasn't coming from unwashed bandages or poor hygiene. It was the scent of tissue dying beneath the skin, of infection that had colonized deep inside his legs where no amount of washing could reach. It was the smell of decay, of a living body rotting from within, and it announced the presence of the most powerful man in England, like a herald no one wanted to hear. The human body, when healthy, is a remarkably efficient system. Wounds seal themselves. Bacteria are contained and eliminated. Dead cells are quietly broken down and recycled. But when that system fails, when infection takes permanent hold, the body begins producing substances it was never meant to create in such quantities. The yellowish discharge seeping from Henry's ulcers wasn't just unpleasant to look at. It was a complex biological soup-dead white blood cells, liquefied tissue, bacterial waste, and proteins breaking down in ways they shouldn't. Medical science calls it purulent exudate. Everyone else simply calls it pus. Fresh pus is relatively odorless. But Henry's wounds were never fresh. The infection had been present for years, cycling through different bacterial strains, each one adapting to whatever treatment was thrown at it. And as bacteria consume dead tissue, they produce waste products, volatile organic compounds that evaporate into the air, carrying with them a distinctive smell that the human nose recognizes instinctively as wrong. It's the same basic chemistry that makes spoiled meat reek. Proteins breaking down into sulfur compounds, amines, fatty acids. Except this wasn't meat in a larder. This was living flesh, still attached to a living person, undergoing decay while the heart continued to beat. The tissue surrounding the ulcers would have been visibly inflamed, red, swollen, radiating heat. When infection becomes chronic, the body's immune response never shuts off. Blood flow to the area increases, trying desperately to deliver more white blood cells to fight an enemy that can't be defeated. The constant inflammation damages surrounding tissue, creating more dead cells, feeding the infection further. And then there were the bandages. Tudor medical practice didn't include the concept of sterile dressings. Linen bandages were washed, yes, but then reused. Sometimes for weeks. They would be wrapped around the weeping ulcers, absorbing pus and blood and whatever substances the physicians had packed into the wounds. By the time they were removed for the next treatment, those bandages had become colonies unto themselves, fabric stiff with dried discharge, harboring layers of organic material in various stages of decomposition. When fresh bandages were applied, they weren't boiled or specially prepared. They were just clean fabric, pressed against open wounds that were teeming with bacteria. Within hours, those pristine white linens would begin the same cycle, absorbing, darkening, becoming saturated with infection. Multiple layers built up over time. Because Henry's legs were never truly bare, that would be improper, even in private. So the bandages were changed, but always replaced immediately. Wound to fabric to air, and back to fabric again, in an endless rotation that ensured the infection always had a warm, moist environment in which to thrive. The smell wasn't just coming from the wounds themselves. It was emanating from everything that touched them, everything near them. Henry's legs had become ecosystems of decay, and the odor was simply the most obvious symptom of a disaster his physicians still couldn't comprehend. Most people experience wounds as temporary disruptions. A cut heals in days. A broken bone mends in weeks. Even serious injuries eventually close, fade to scars, become stories rather than present realities. But Henry's wounds existed in a permanent present tense. Every morning, they were there. Every night, they remained. Imagine waking up, and before you're fully conscious, feeling the dampness against your skin. The bandages have soaked through again during the night. The seepage never stops, never even slows. It's simply part of existence, now the constant wetness, the perpetual awareness of fluid leaving your body in ways it shouldn't. There's no moment of relief, no afternoon where you forget about the wounds, because they've stopped hurting. The pain is always there, sometimes a dull throb, other times sharp and piercing when movement tears partially healed tissue. And movement is unavoidable. Even lying in bed shifts weight, creates pressure, pulls at inflamed flesh. Standing is worse. Blood rushes to the legs, increasing the pressure inside the ulcers. The sensation is described by modern patients with similar wounds as throbbing or bursting, as if the wounds are trying to explode outward. Henry would have felt this every time he rose, every time he walked from one room to another. And he couldn't stop walking. Kings don't retire to bed indefinitely. Courtiers expect audiences. Council meetings demand attendance. Simply maintaining authority requires physical presence, and presence requires movement. So the partially healed tissue tears, again and again. Just when the body manages to form the thinnest layer of new skin over the ulcer, some necessary activity rips it open. The wound that was almost closed yesterday is weeping freely again today. Modern wound care has developed sophisticated techniques, negative pressure therapy, that actively pulls fluid from wounds, specialized dressings that maintain ideal moisture levels, strict protocols for cleaning and bandaging. None of this existed in Henry's time. His wounds were simply wrapped in linen and left. No active drainage system beyond the body's own failing attempts. No antimicrobial dressings to suppress bacterial growth. No pain medication beyond wine. And occasionally, opium derivatives that left him foggy and unable to think clearly. The psychological weight of chronic wounds is something modern medicine has only recently begun to study seriously. Depression rates among patients with non-healing ulcers are extraordinarily high. The constant pain, the social isolation caused by odor and appearance, the loss of mobility and independence, it erodes the will to continue. And Henry couldn't even discuss it openly. A king's body is supposed to be perfect, almost divine. To admit the extent of his suffering would be to admit weakness, to give enemies ammunition, to appear vulnerable in a political landscape where vulnerability was fatal. So he suffered in a silence, punctuated only by occasional letters to trusted allies, carefully worded references to humors and indisposition that masked the daily horror of living inside a body that was, inch by inch, destroying itself. Pain changes people. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, like water wearing away stone. And chronic pain, the kind that never relents, never offers even a moment's peace, doesn't just change people. It transforms them into something unrecognizable. The Henry VIII who fell from his horse in 1536 was not a gentle man. He was already capable of ruthlessness, already willing to break with Rome and reshape an entire nation's religion to suit his needs. But there was still warmth there, still moments of generosity and genuine affection for those around him. A man who emerged from years of unrelenting agony was something darker. Historians have long debated what caused Henry's transformation from Renaissance prince to paranoid tyrant. Some point to political pressures. Others suggest brain damage from the jousting accident. But there's another factor that can't be ignored. He was in constant, excruciating pain, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Modern medical research has shown that chronic pain fundamentally alters brain chemistry. It depletes serotonin and dopamine, the chemicals responsible for mood regulation. It keeps the nervous system in a permanent state of high alert, where every stimulus is interpreted as a potential threat. Sleep becomes difficult, and without proper rest, cognitive function deteriorates. Now add to this the humiliation. Henry had built his identity around physical prowess. He'd been the athlete, the dancer, the tournament champion. Ambassadors wrote glowing reports of his strength and grace. And now he couldn't walk across a room without assistance. Couldn't mount a horse. Couldn't even stand for long periods without the wounds reopening. His physicians kept telling him to rest, to limit his activities. But resting meant admitting defeat. It meant acknowledging that his body was failing, that he was no longer the man he'd been. So he pushed himself, ignored their advice, and paid for it with fresh waves of agony when the wounds tore open again. The cruelty that became his hallmark, the sudden executions, the paranoid accusations, the inability to forgive even minor slights, all of it intensified as the pain worsened. When you hurt constantly, when every moment of existence is colored by physical suffering, it becomes harder to extend empathy to others. Their problems seem trivial. Their pain seems insignificant compared to your own. And when you're a king, when you have absolute power over life and death, that lack of empathy has consequences. Was Henry evil? Or was he simply a man trapped in a nightmare his own body had created, lashing out at a world that couldn't understand what he was enduring? Perhaps the answer is that chronic agony had eroded the line between the two, until even he couldn't tell the difference anymore. Late February, 1541. The court was in the middle of its usual intrigues, factional disputes, marriage negotiations, the endless maneuvering for the king's favor. Then word spread through the palace corridors in urgent whispers. The king's leg had closed. To anyone outside the inner circle, this might have sounded like good news. A wound closing, wasn't that healing? But those who had attended Henry through previous episodes knew better. They knew what came next. Henry knew too. And he was terrified. The ulcer on his left leg, which had been draining reliably for months, had suddenly sealed over. The fistula had closed, the opening blocked by new tissue that his body had formed in some misguided attempt at repair. And now all that infection, the pus, the bacteria, the products of decay, had nowhere to go. The French ambassador was among the first outsiders to be informed. His dispatch back to Paris documented what happened next with clinical precision. The king had developed a fever, not the mild warmth of a summer cold, but a dangerous heat that left him shaking one moment and drenched in sweat the next. But it wasn't just a bodily malady, the ambassador noted. There was something else. Mal de spirit, a sickness of the spirit. Henry's mind was affected. He became agitated, confused, speaking of things that made no sense. His face took on that alarming pallor they'd seen before, the one that meant his body was fighting a battle it couldn't win. The physicians recognized the pattern immediately. They'd seen it happen before, would see it again. The closed fistula had trapped the infection inside, and now it was spreading through his bloodstream. What modern medicine calls sepsis was taking hold, bacteria multiplying unchecked, releasing toxins that affected every organ system. Henry's council watched and waited, making quiet contingency plans. Who would succeed him if he died? What would happen to the kingdom? The same questions that had been asked during the jousting accident 5 years earlier, during every crisis since. But the physicians acted quickly this time. They knew what needed to be done, even if they didn't understand why it worked. The wound had to be reopened. The infection needed an escape route. They brought out their instruments, probes, to find the blockage, tools to pierce through the newly formed tissue. It would have been agonizing, this deliberate re-wounding of flesh that had just begun to heal. But Henry submitted without protest, because he knew, as surely as his doctors did, that the alternative was death. The blockage was cleared. The drainage resumed. And slowly, over the following days, the fever broke. Henry's mind cleared. The crisis passed. He had survived again. But the alarm in that phrase, to his great alarm, reveals everything. This wasn't relief at healing. This was terror at what closing wounds meant for a body that could no longer afford to heal properly. The human body is designed for movement. Muscles need use or they atrophy. Joints require regular motion or they stiffen. Blood vessels depend on physical activity to maintain proper circulation. Henry's body, once a marvel of athletic conditioning, was now caught in a vicious cycle from which there was no escape. Walking caused pain. The wounds would tear open with exertion, bleeding fresh and requiring days to even partially close again. So Henry walked less. He canceled hunts, avoided the long corridors of his palaces, spent more time seated or lying down. But immobility brought its own catastrophe. The veins in his legs, already compromised by the original injuries, needed muscle contractions to push blood back up toward the heart. When Henry stopped moving, blood began pooling in his lower extremities. The pooling increased pressure in the veins, which damaged the vessel walls further, which made the ulcers worse, which made movement more painful, which led to more immobility. Around and around, each factor feeding the next. And then there was the wait. Court records show Henry's armor being let out repeatedly during the final decade of his life. His waist measurement, once a trim 32 inches, expanded to 52. Some modern estimates put his final weight at nearly 400 pounds. For a man who stood just over 6 feet tall, this was devastating. Every pound added stress to joints already inflamed by what was likely gout. Every ounce increased the burden on legs that could barely support his frame. And the extra weight meant worse circulation, more pressure on the ulcers, slower healing of any tissue that did manage to regenerate. The king who had once outlasted his courtiers on the dance floor now required specially designed furniture to move between rooms. Elaborate chairs fitted with poles so servants could carry him like some grotesque parody of a royal procession. Mechanical devices, early ancestors of elevators, were installed to lift him between floors because stairs had become impossible. His world shrank, not just physically, though that was part of it, the reduction from palace to bedroom to chair, but mentally as well. When your universe consists of pain management and bodily functions, when simply getting through the day requires Herculean effort, there's no energy left for the larger questions of governance or philosophy. Courtiers noticed the change. Ambassadors documented it. The king who had once engaged in hours-long theological debates now had trouble focusing on conversations. He would drift mid-sentence, his attention pulled back to his legs, to the constant awareness of infection and discomfort. And still he ate, because food was one of the few pleasures left that didn't require movement, didn't cause pain, didn't remind him of what he'd lost. Elaborate banquets became his solace, the taste, the richness, the temporary distraction of sensation that wasn't agony. But every meal made the next day harder, made standing more difficult, made the wounds drain more heavily, made the smell worse. His body had become a prison, and he was both the jailer and the condemned. In 1545, 2 years before Henry's death, a physician named Ambroise Paré was revolutionizing surgery in France. He had discovered that gunshot wounds healed better without boiling oil. He was pioneering new techniques for amputation, for controlling bleeding, for understanding that gentle treatment often worked better than aggressive intervention. But Paré's discoveries hadn't reached England, and even if they had, they couldn't have helped Henry, because the real enemy was invisible, buried deep inside his legs where no 16th century physician could see or reach. Tudor doctors had developed an elaborate theoretical framework to explain disease. They could discourse for hours on the balance of humors, on hot and cold qualities, on the influence of planetary alignments on bodily health. But they had no concept of bacteria, no understanding that microscopic organisms could colonize tissue and cause infection. They looked at Henry's wounds and saw corruption that needed to be drained. They never imagined that deep beneath the ulcers, inside the bone itself, colonies of bacteria had established permanent residence. These microorganisms had found an ideal environment, warm, moist, protected from the immune system by layers of dead tissue. Modern medical analysis suggests Henry was suffering from chronic osteomyelitis, an infection of the bone marrow. When bacteria penetrate to this level, they trigger a cascade of destruction. The body sends white blood cells to fight the invasion, but the bacteria are protected inside the bone's hard structure. The white blood cells die, creating pus. The bone tissue itself begins to necrose, to die. As bone dies, fragments break away. These pieces of dead bone, called sequestra, are foreign objects as far as the body is concerned. The immune system tries to expel them, forming abscesses and fistulae to push them toward the surface. Everything Henry's physicians observed: the drainage channels, the recurring infections, the pieces of material emerging from the wounds, was his body's desperate attempt to rid itself of its own skeleton. But without surgical removal of the dead bone, without antibiotics to kill the bacteria, the infection simply persisted, month after month, year after year. There's a particular tragedy in this. Henry had access to the best medical minds in Europe. He spent fortunes on treatments, consulted with physicians from multiple countries, even developed his own remedies based on the most advanced medical texts available. None of it was ignorance or neglect. It was simply that the knowledge required to save him didn't exist yet, wouldn't exist for another 300 years. The germ theory of disease wouldn't be developed until the 1860s. Antibiotics wouldn't be discovered until 1928. Modern orthopedic surgery capable of debriding infected bone wouldn't emerge until the mid-20th century. Henry VIII died in 1547, 400 years too early. If he had fallen from that horse in 1936, instead of 1536, he would have been rushed to a hospital. Surgeons would have x-rayed his legs, identified the bone damage, removed the infected tissue. He would have received penicillin, spent weeks recovering, then returned to normal life with nothing more than a scar and an interesting story. Instead, he endured 11 years of escalating agony, treated by men who were doing their absolute best with tools and knowledge that were utterly inadequate for the task. January 28, 1547, Whitehall Palace. The king's bedchamber was crowded with physicians, attendants, and clergy. Outside, in the corridors and courtyards, the entire court waited in tense silence. Everyone knew what was coming. Henry VIII was dying, not from the wounds directly. They had been killing him slowly for 11 years. But this final decline was something else. His massive body, worn down by chronic infection, excess weight, and years of suffering, was simply giving up. Multiple organ systems were failing simultaneously. His heart, stressed by decades of supporting such enormous mass, was weakening. His kidneys, damaged by repeated bouts of sepsis, were shutting down. But the legs, those terrible, infected legs, remained with him until the very end. The ulcers that had opened in 1536 never healed, not truly. For 11 years, they had wept and drained, closed temporarily only to reopen, formed fistulae that became permanent features of his anatomy. 11 years of red-hot pokers and useless poultices. 11 years of bone fragments working their way to the surface. 11 years of smell and pain and treatments that made everything worse. In those final hours, as Henry drifted in and out of consciousness, did he remember what it felt like to walk without pain? To mount a horse in one fluid motion? To dance until dawn, his body strong and responsive and entirely under his control? Or had the pain lasted so long that he couldn't recall a time before it? The historical record tells us what was inside those wounds. The modern medical analysis is clear. Purulent drainage from chronic infection. Fistulae connecting abscess cavities to the skin surface. Dead bone working through dying tissue. Bacteria that had colonized deep inside the marrow, protected from every treatment Tudor medicine could devise. But the record also tells us something else. Despite everything, despite the agony, the humiliation, the progressive loss of mobility and dignity, Henry survived for 11 years after that jousting accident. His body, even as it rotted, fought with remarkable tenacity. The infections that should have killed him within months were held at bay by an immune system that never stopped trying, even when success was impossible. He died at 55 years old, considered elderly by Tudor standards, but not exceptionally so. Some of his contemporaries lived into their 70s. Without the leg wounds, without the chronic infections slowly poisoning his system, Henry might have been one of them. Instead, his legacy became inseparable from his decay. The vibrant athlete transformed into the grotesque invalid. The Renaissance prince consumed by his own rotting flesh. A king brought down not by war or assassination, but by bacteria, too small to see, and bone fragments his own body couldn't expel. What they really found inside Henry VIII's ulcerated legs was a tragedy in biological form. A brilliant, powerful man trapped inside a body that had become his enemy. defeated by wounds that would have been survivable in any other century but his own.